Welcome to the Deep Dive, everyone. Ready to dive into something new today?
Always.
Great. Today we're taking a look at a book by Ralf Bohnsack.
Oh, okay.
It's called Praxiological Knowledge Sociology.
Wow. That's a mouthful.
It is. But stick with us, all right? It's actually a pretty fascinating look at how we can understand society in a whole new light through this thing he calls, well, praxeological knowledge sociology.
So it's like sociology, but more. What's the praxiological part all about?
Yeah, that's the really interesting part. It's about going beyond just observing what people say and, actually trying to decode the knowledge that's embedded in our actions.
Okay, so like what we do reveals more than what we say, that kind of thing.
Exactly. It's about those unspoken rules, routines, even like ingrained habits, the stuff we barely notice,
Yeah.
like a hidden grammar of social life.
Yeah.
And we're going to try to decipher it together.
Sounds like a challenge. So where do we even begin with this?
Well, Bohnsack kind of lays the groundwork in the first chapter. Right. He introduces this core concept of praxeological knowledge sociology. And it's kind of like shifting from just watching social interactions to actually understanding the why behind them. Like, why do we act the way we do? What's the unspoken knowledge that's driving our behavior?
Okay, so we're not just watching the dance. We're trying to figure out the choreography.
Precisely. The steps that everyone seems to know instinctively.
Okay.
But I got to ask, is there a risk of overthinking this? Like, sometimes a handshake is just a handshake, right?
That's a good point, and that's where Chapter 2 comes in, I think. It takes us back in time a bit, exploring this whole idea in the context of Karl Mannheim's work.
Mannheim.
Yeah, he was a sociologist back in the day who argued against this idea of, a purely rational economic man. Like, we're not just robots making decisions in a vacuum. He believed that our knowledge is actually deeply intertwined with our experiences, our position in the world.
Okay, so it's not that rationality doesn't exist. It's more like acknowledging that our actions are shaped by a whole bunch of social factors, things that often operate like beneath the surface.
Yeah, like those times you just react to a situation without even thinking, almost on autopilot.
Oh, totally. I do that all the time.
Right. And that's where this thing called the documentary method comes in.
Okay, what's that?
It's a tool for uncovering the implicit knowledge in our actions. Like, you become a detective looking for clues in everyday life to understand the unspoken rules of the game.
Interesting. So we're actively interpreting, not just passively observing.
Exactly. We're looking for those subtle cues, the stuff that reveals the logic behind social interactions, like learning to read between the lines, but not of text, but of human behavior.
This is getting really interesting. Are there any specific examples of how this works in practice?
Oh, absolutely. In Chapter 3, Bohnsack introduces this idea of conjunctive knowledge. It's basically saying that much of what we know and how we act is actually driven by things we're not even conscious of.
Wait, so I might do something and not even know why.
Kind of, yeah. It's like that social autopilot you mentioned earlier.
Well, that's a little freaky, isn't it?
Well, it can be, but it's also kind of fascinating when you think about it. And it's not just about individual actions either. This conjunctive knowledge shapes how we interact in groups, too.
How so?
That's where the conjunctive experience space comes in.
Yeah.
Think about your workplace. There's probably all these unwritten rules everyone just knows.
Oh, yeah, totally. Like when to grab coffee or how to approach the boss about something.
Exactly. That's a conjunctive experience space in action. It's how groups develop those shared understandings that guide their behavior, but often without even realizing it.
That makes so much sense. So each group has its own kind of unspoken operating system.
That's a great way to put it. And that brings us to another key element, power. How power dynamics play into all of this.
Power. Okay, now we're getting into some serious territory.
We are. Bohnsack argues that folks in positions of authority can actually use their actions and interpretations to kind of shape the social reality of others. Not always through force, but through these subtle influences.
So they're framing the situation in a way that benefits them.
Exactly. It's about understanding how those subtle influences, those unspoken rules, can be used to maintain power imbalances.
It's kind of scary when you think about it, how much of this is happening without us even noticing.
Right. And that's why understanding these concepts is so important. It makes us more aware, helps us make more conscious choices about how we participate. But let's move on to Chapter 4, which goes deeper into conjunctive experience spaces.
All right, so if conjunctive knowledge is our individual operating system, conjunctive experience spaces are how groups create a shared one.
Right. The unspoken rules that make groups tick.
I'm ready to see how this plays out in different settings. What kind of examples does Bohnsack give?
Well, one he talks about is the idea of organizational milieus. It's this notion that each organization develops its own culture, a set of implicit rules and norms. Like each one has its own dialect of that hidden grammar we're talking about.
Okay, so it's not just about individual personalities, it's about those shared understandings that shape the whole feel of a place, like the vibe of the office, for example.
Exactly. And understanding this can be super helpful, especially when things aren't going smoothly. You can identify those hidden friction points.
Like where people are misinterpreting the rules, leading to misunderstandings.
Right. It's like having a roadmap to navigate those tricky social landscapes within organizations.
Wow, this is already giving me so much to think about. It's
Right.
like we're getting this new lens to see all these subtle social forces.
Exactly. We've been handed a new way to look at things, but we're just scratching the surface here.
I know, right? There's so much more to explore. So what's next in our deep dive into inhuman sociology?
Well, Chapter 5 takes us deeper into this world of implicit knowledge. Bohnsack explores the different forms it takes, from practical skills to those tacit understandings. He even uses examples like this concept of typifications to explain how we use this knowledge to navigate complex social situations.
Typifications. Now that's a new one.
It's a good one, though, trust me. Think of them as mental shortcuts we use to categorize people and situations, based on our past experiences.
Okay, so it's about recognizing patterns, even if we don't know why we see them.
Exactly. Those intuitive judgments we make based on all our accumulated social knowledge, stuff that's operating below the surface.
It's like when you meet someone new and you instantly get a vibe, but you can't quite explain why.
That's a great example. But studying this kind of knowledge must be tough, right? I mean, how do you observe something people aren't even aware of themselves?
That's a good point. What tools does praxeological sociology offer for getting at that deeper level of understanding?
Well, this is where things get even more interesting. Chapter 6 takes us beyond verbal data, showing how this approach can be used to analyze, get this, photographs and films.
Hold on. Photos and films. That's a whole new level of social observation. How does that even work?
It's about recognizing that even images, they're constructed, shaped by the choices of whoever took the picture. Things like the composition, the framing, even the subject's pose, they can reveal a lot about power dynamics, cultural norms, all of that.
So even a family photo can be decoded to reveal those hidden layers of meaning. It's like we're learning to read a whole new language.
It is. And he uses this fascinating example from Sebastian Salgado's work.
Oh yeah, the photographer.
Yes, a portrait of a family in Brazil. It's about poverty and how the way it's framed reinforces a certain narrative.
It's like even well-intentioned images can carry these hidden messages. It's a reminder to always be critical, to ask whose perspective is being shown.
Absolutely. And this is just the tip of the iceberg.
I know, we've covered so much already and my mind is blown.
It's a lot, right? But it's also interconnected. It all builds on itself.
Agreed. This inhuman sociology is challenging us to think differently, to see things we might have missed before.
Exactly.
We've laid a good foundation here, but there's still so much more to uncover.
Yeah, we've only just begun to scratch the surface.
When we come back, we'll dive into even more insights from the book and see how this approach can be applied to real-world examples.
I can't wait.
Me neither. Stay tuned, listeners. There's a lot more to come.
Don't go anywhere. Welcome back to the deep dive. Ready for more inhuman sociology.
Oh, I'm ready to dive even deeper. We've uncovered so much already, about this hidden grammar of social life, all those unspoken rules and stuff.
Yeah, it's fascinating, isn't it?
Totally. And I'm really curious to see how these concepts play out in different, social contexts.
Well, good news, because that's exactly what Chapter 7 is all about. It introduces this idea of social experience spaces, focusing on milieu and generations.
Social experience spaces. Milieu. Okay, you're going to have to break that down for me.
Sure. Think of it this way. Shared experiences, historical, cultural, all that, create distinct social groups. Each group has its own worldview, its own set of practices. That's the milieu.
Okay, so people who grew up in the same era, they might share a certain milieu because of those shared experiences.
Exactly. Think about different generations. Boomers, Gen X, Millennials, Gen Z, they all have their own milieu shaped by the events and trends they lived through.
It's like each generation has its own cultural DNA, right? A unique set of values and perspectives.
Exactly. And that explains why you sometimes get those classic generational clashes, okay, boomer and all that. It's because they're coming from different milieus.
Makes sense. So is this approach saying that we can bridge those gaps if we understand these different milieus?
Absolutely. Praxiological sociology gives us this framework for understanding those differences, not as personality clashes, but as like stemming from these deeper social and historical forces. It's all about empathy and understanding.
I'm really digging this idea.
Yeah.
But how does all of this connect to, like, power dynamics? We talked about that before, how those in authority can shape reality for others. Does this milieu play into that?
Oh, absolutely. That's a key point, and Chapter 8 dives right into it, focusing on external framing and power.
Okay, so it's not just recognizing those power dynamics, it's like seeing how they're actually created.
You got it. It's about those framing techniques, those shared understandings within groups. Sometimes it gets a little uncomfortable, to be honest.
I can imagine. But it's got to be important to understand how power really operates, right? Especially if it's invisible to those who benefit from it.
Totally. And Bohnsack talks about these things called degradation ceremonies to illustrate this.
Whoa, degradation ceremonies, that sounds intense. What's that about?
Well, think of it like this. Say a teacher publicly humiliates a student for something minor. It's not just about correcting the behavior, it's about lowering the student's standing in the class.
Oh, wow. So it's a way of reinforcing the teacher's authority, like a power move.
Exactly. And these degradation ceremonies can happen in all sorts of settings. Workplaces, families, even online. Power can be subtle, insidious.
It's like a reminder to always be aware, to question what's really going on beneath the surface.
Right. And the book has tons of examples of this in organizations, politics, even everyday conversations. It's powerful stuff.
This is seriously eye-opening. But before we get too lost in the power stuff, I'm curious about how this whole approach connects to other, like, big ideas in sociology. Is it totally unique, or does it build on existing stuff?
That's a great question. And Chapter 9 explores just that, looking at connections to other traditions. Bohnsack is clear that this isn't some isolated theory, it's part of a larger conversation.
Okay, so it's building on what's come before. Like, who are some of the thinkers that are influential here?
Well, he talks about social phenomenology, particularly Alfred Schutz and his idea of typifications, which we touched on earlier.
Oh, yeah. The mental shortcuts we use to categorize people. Right.
That's it. And he also connects with Pierre Bourdieu, his concept of habitus.
Bourdieu, the French sociologist.
That's the one. It's all about those ingrained habits, those dispositions that shape our behavior.
I get it. It's like praxeological sociology is giving us a way to understand how that habitus develops and how it interacts with these broader social structures, those milieus and power dynamics we've been discussing.
Yes. And then there's Nicholas Luhmann, too. His systems theory is all about how these complex social systems work, like organizations and institutions.
So it's not just about individuals or groups, it's about how all those dynamics fit into these larger systems.
Right. It's a more holistic view. But I gotta ask, with all this theory, are there any practical applications? Can we actually use this knowledge to make a difference?
Yeah, that's a good question. Like, can this stuff actually help people?
For sure. That's what Chapter 10 is all about, implications for practice. Bohnsack believes this approach can be applied in various fields, like education, social work, even organizational development.
Okay, so it's not just some abstract theory. It can be used to solve problems. I'm intrigued. Give me some examples.
Well, take education, for example. Praxiological sociology can help us understand those unspoken classroom dynamics. How they contribute to things like achievement gaps.
You mean like instead of just looking at test scores,
Mhm.
we can look at how teachers and students interact, the unspoken expectations, maybe even biases.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that education is a social process, shaped by those power dynamics and implicit understandings.
Wow. Makes you think about your own experiences in school, right?
Totally. And the book provides specific examples of how these insights can lead to real change, creating more inclusive classrooms and addressing those deep-seated inequalities.
This is awesome. So praxeological sociology is like shining a light on those hidden aspects of social life, the stuff that really matters but we often miss.
That's it. It's about those subtle dynamics that shape our opportunities, our experiences, everything.
But wow, we've covered so much ground. My brain needs a little break to process all this.
Mine too. It's intense but so rewarding, isn't it?
Absolutely. This Inhuman Sociology is all about seeing the world with new eyes, right? Noticing those hidden patterns.
That's it.
When we come back, we'll dive into even more fascinating examples, seeing how these concepts play out in concrete situations.
I can't wait.
And we'll talk about how we can use this knowledge to create positive change, both in our own lives and in the world around us.
That's the goal. So stay tuned, listeners. We've got more to uncover.
All right, welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the final stretch of our exploration of inhuman sociology, and my brain is ready for some more concrete examples.
I hear ya. It's one thing to grasp the theory, but seeing it in action, that's what really brings it home.
Exactly, like those conjunctive experience spaces we keep talking about, remember? Those unspoken understandings that shape how groups operate. I'm ready to see how those play out in real life situations.
Well, you're in luck. Because Bohnsack gives us a super interesting comparison in Chapter 3 using two very different youth groups, rock bands and hooligans.
Oh, yeah. I remember this one. It's wild how he uses them to show how those conjunctive experience spaces can lead to, like, totally different outcomes, right?
Right. He found that rock bands, often coming from similar backgrounds, sharing that passion for music, they develop a conjunctive experience space that was all about collaboration, creativity, a shared purpose. Like they had this unspoken language that helped them connect and create together.
Like they were all on the same wavelength, intuitively understanding each other.
Totally. But then you look at the hooligans, and their conjunctive experience space was built around something else entirely. That shared experience of being marginalized, needing to belong, but often expressing it through, well, aggression and territoriality.
Yeah, it's like their shared experience of exclusion created a different kind of bond, one that unfortunately manifested in destructive ways.
Exactly. It's a powerful example of how group dynamics can really impact individual choices and actions.
Makes you think about all sorts of groups. Sports teams, political movements, even online communities were all part of these invisible networks shaped by shared experiences.
And each with its own set of unspoken rules and norms.
Exactly. So this concept of conjunctive experience space can help us understand how trends spread, how conflicts erupt, all these social phenomena we see playing out around us.
It's like a secret decoder ring for social life, helping us see those patterns we might otherwise miss.
This is incredible. But I also want to see how Bohnsack applies these ideas to those power dynamics we discussed earlier. Remember, it's not just about recognizing power. It's about understanding how it works, through those subtle cues and framing techniques.
Absolutely. And he gives a really thought-provoking example in Chapter 6 using a photograph by Sebastião Salgado, that portrait of the impoverished family in Brazil.
Yeah, I remember that one. On the surface, it's a really moving image, right? But then he breaks it down and reveals all these hidden layers of meaning.
Right. He argues that the way the photo is composed, the framing, it actually reinforces a certain narrative about poverty, one that kind of blames the family for their situation.
It's like the photographer, maybe unintentionally, is framing poverty as a personal failing rather than a systemic issue. It's a powerful reminder that even images, which we often think of as objective, can be used to reinforce existing power structures.
Absolutely. We have to be critical consumers of visual media,
Mhm.
always asking whose perspective is being presented, what messages are being subtly conveyed.
Exactly. Praxiological sociology gives us those tools, right? To decode those hidden messages and see the power dynamics at play, even in seemingly neutral representations of reality.
And it's not just about visual media. Bohnsack also looks at how this stuff plays out in language, in everyday interactions. Like in Chapter 8, he analyzes transcripts from counseling sessions, showing how different styles can either reinforce or challenge those power imbalances.
Oh, right. The example with the directive versus the collaborative counseling approach. It's fascinating how those subtle differences in communication can make such a huge difference in the power dynamic.
It shows that power isn't always about commands or force. It can be about those unspoken expectations, those subtle ways of framing things that influence how we see ourselves and our options.
It's like we're constantly negotiating these power dynamics
Right.
in all sorts of relationships with doctors, at work, even with our friends and family. And we might not even realize it's happening.
That's why this stuff is so important to understand. Praxiological sociology helps us become more aware of those dynamics so we can make more conscious choices about how we participate.
This has been an amazing deep dive. I feel like I've learned so much, and I'm definitely seeing the world in a whole new way. It's like I've been given this incredible new lens for understanding the hidden forces that shape our social reality.
Me too. It's been a journey of uncovering those invisible patterns and dynamics that influence our lives, often without us even knowing it.
This deep dive has just scratched the surface, right? There's so much more to explore in this book, and I encourage everyone listening to check it out.
Definitely. And remember, it's not just about acquiring knowledge. It's about using that knowledge to create a more just, equitable, and fulfilling world. That's what Inhuman Sociology is all about.
So to our listeners, we leave you with this. If our actions reveal more than our words, what does your behavior say about the world you inhabit? Go out there, observe, interpret, and maybe even challenge those unspoken rules that shape your reality.
Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep. We'll see you on our next adventure.